وبه نستعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. In the Holy Quran, in chapter 12, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. And in describing the story of Yusuf, Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحن نقص عليك أحسن القصص. That this is from the best of narratives, the story of Yusuf. And when you go through the surah from the beginning till the end, it becomes apparent why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the story of Yusuf such a station in the Quran. Because when we go from the beginning all the way till the end, each and every part and each and every journey that Yusuf undertakes in his tumultuous lifetime is detailed in every segment, in every moment. And his reaction to the ups and downs that he faces in his life are documented to understand his psychology and the way that he deals with these situations. So, as a very brief overview, when we look at the beginning of the surah, it starts off with Yusuf displaying a sign of his impending prophethood, in that he has a dream where he sees the sun, the moon, the stars prostrating to him. And then this dream leads to jealousy amongst his brothers. And Yusuf goes from being in the lap of prophethood to descending down into the pits of darkness, quite literally by being thrown into the well by his own brothers. And then from this journey to the bottom of the pit, from the bottom of the well, Yusuf goes through an interesting journey. If anyone were to go through this journey now, they'd probably say we need to write a film about this or write a book about it. It's so interesting, the various different paths that Yusuf finds himself in. But he goes into the world of slavery, then he goes into the world of aristocracy and finds himself in the house of one of the biggest politicians of his time. Then Yusuf gets embroiled in a scandal, which is no fault of his own, and he ends up going into prison for a while. And then eventually he comes out of prison and ascends to the thrones of power and gets a station and a maqam where he is overseeing the agriculture and the affairs of the people. And then the story takes a complete turn back to the start from where it began, where Yusuf realizes the dream that he has as a child. So that's just like a brief overview of the journey. But what I wanted to do today is I wanted to focus and zoom in on a particular aspect of Yusuf's life. And that aspect is when Yusuf, as a child, when he's taken out of the well and he goes into the world of slavery, and then he's taken in by the aristocrat who goes by the name of Potiphar, Yusuf finds himself in this aristocrat's house, and he's raised and nurtured in this house. And he goes through his phase of being a young child to going into the young adulthood phase. And the Quran talks about this, where it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ آتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. That Yusuf goes and he's in that transitionary phase from being a young adult to from being a young child to being an adult, and he attains maturity, and Allah gives him wisdom and knowledge. And he gives the reason as to why he's been given wisdom and knowledge, because Yusuf is a doer of good. He's been good early in his life, and it's a lesson for us, because sometimes when we're younger, we might commit sins, we might go to university, we might go to college, and we might just think that, okay, we can do whatever we want to do, we can, go to the parties, go to the clubs, and it's not a problem. But Yusuf shows us here that in his young age, he's committed to God, he's committed to being a good individual, and therefore he attains a station and a rank because of this. Now, the aspect in particular I want to look at is when Yusuf reaches this kind of adulthood phase. And the Mufassirin say that he's roughly around about maybe 18, 19, 20, 21, something around that age. And then Yusuf reaches a level of maturity. And at this point, the aristocrat who had taken him into his house and who had nurtured him, his wife starts to make movements toward Yusuf. You know, she wants to court him, she wants to attract him, and she calls him towards her. And the Quran says, وَقَالَتْ هَيْتَ لَكَ قَالَ مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ. So this lady, she's secluded Yusuf, she's kept him in a room, she's locked the doors, and when she calls him near, Yusuf, his first response is to say what? Is to say that he seeks refuge in Allah. That's his first and foremost response. If many of us were in that situation, we maybe even commit the sin, but if we didn't commit the sin, we might start making excuses. We might say, for example, oh, what if somebody walks in, or what if, for example, we get caught, or this isn't right. We might make excuses, but Yusuf's first and foremost thought is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this shows us that even in the most difficult circumstances, Yusuf prioritizes Allah. He keeps Allah at the forefront of his mind. And he then explains why he's done this. Later in the same ayah, he says, إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, that the unjust, they don't prosper, they don't become successful. And this is a good lesson again, because sometimes when we are going through certain trials, or we're exposed out there in the world and we're exposed to certain sins, we might think it's just a short moment of time, it's just a short moment of satisfaction that we're going to achieve. What's the harm in it? What's the harm in, for example, taking this alcohol, or what's the harm in taking this drug, for example? It's only a short period of time in my life. I'm only young. But Yusuf is an example for us, because he realizes that that short moment of time can later on cause him big problems going further. So sometimes we think in the moment, we think in the here and now, but he was thinking ahead. He was thinking into the future and what the repercussions of it could be. So it's like, for example, when you have some women, when they're going into dieting and they start getting strict with the dieting, they'll say like, a moment on the lips is a lifetime on the hips, for example, yeah? So they use these examples to say that that short moment of gratification isn't worth it. And Yusuf is a prime example of this within the Quran. And what's interesting is when she makes the advances and then eventually she becomes exposed because of her bad inclinations towards Yusuf. Yusuf also shows us that sometimes we can act and we can be religious, for example. We may, for example, study, we may try and go closer towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but sincerity is key in our actions. Being sincere, being humble, understanding that we are trying to strive towards Allah, not towards the dunya, because even the slight insincere action may not give us fruition in our life. And Yusuf, and Allah explains this, when she makes the advance, the following ayah say that she made for him and he would have made for her as well, had it not been that he'd seen the manifest evidence of his Lord. So it was Allah that protected him. So just as Yusuf made efforts towards Allah, he also had to depend on Allah to guide him, on Allah to protect him. So it isn't just a unilateral thing, we have to also expect Allah to help us, to protect us. And it ends with, in the same ayah, إِنَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِنَا الْمُخْلَصِينَ, that he was one of the sincere servants. So he had sincerity. He wanted sincerely to come towards Allah. He didn't have an ulterior motive. He didn't want it for fame. He didn't want to be religious for a certain reason. He did it to truly seek closeness to Allah. So then Allah also brought him towards him. And finally, in this, before I end this section of the khutbah, this is what I really wanted to kind of build up to, is Yusuf's famous line that he says, which is an eternal line, a line that me and you can learn from. And in this difficult moment, imagine being in the house of an aristocrat. If you bring it into like today's context, Yusuf's position was kind of like how we have politicians now. And each politician, especially if they're like a front bencher, they're famous, they may be in the front benches of parliament, each of them will have their own staff members that will help them to do their research or sort their meetings out and their arrangements. And sometimes they'll have a head of staff. And Yusuf was almost like the head of staff for this aristocrat, for this politician of his time. So imagine the power that he had. He wasn't just a servant. In fact, Potiphar, his master, the person that was in control of his affairs at that time, and who he was subservient to at the time, he said in the ayahs of the Quran that he earmarked Yusuf to not only be his servant, but to try and make him into something more, maybe adopt him as a son, because he saw the nobility and the humility of Yusuf, and he saw that he could potentially be a great statesman. So Yusuf had this close connection to Potiphar and his wife, and he had a lot of power. He could have easily gone into sin, he could have easily gone into corruption. It wasn't an issue. He probably could have even potentially hidden it as well. But he chose a different path because he was sincere to God. His love for God overpowered anything else. And because the wife of Potiphar, she got angry, she got annoyed that she'd been rejected. She said to him, when she gathered all the women, as you all know, you may have seen the movie, when she gathers all the women from the town after her attempts have been exposed, she says to Yusuf that if you don't succumb to me now and succumb to the women, then you'll go into prison. But she doesn't just say prison, she says, وَلَا يَكُونَنْ مِنَ الصَّاغِرِينَ. She wanted to humiliate him. She wanted to make him the lowest of the low people by throwing him into prison. So either he commits the sin and he's free in her perspective of being free, or he faces the humiliation of going to prison. But this is where Yusuf's words resonate with us and are a beacon of light for us. Because Yusuf says in response to this, he says, قَالَ رَبِّ السِّجْنُ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا يَدْعُونَنِي إِلَيْهِ. That, my Lord, prison is more dearer to me than what they call me towards. So he turned to Allah and said that I would rather go to prison, I would rather go and face years in prison than to do this sin, than to commit this sin. And it's a great lesson for us all to understand the psychology of Yusuf and to understand the God consciousness that these individuals had and the prophets of God had. And inshallah we'll continue in the second part. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. It's narrated in Al-Kafi on the authority of Imam Al-Sadiq salawatullah wa salamu alayhi salawatullah wa sallallahu alayhi with an authentic chain that Imam Al-Sadiq is reported to have said, إِنَّ الْحُرَّ حُرٌّ عَلَى جَمِيعِ أَحْوَالِهِ. That the free person is free in all of his states. The Imam continues and says, when he's inflicted by a calamity, he shows patience. When he or she's afflictions bear down upon them, they don't break them. Even though he may be taken in captivity, defeated, and his prosperity turns into poverty, just like the truthful, trustworthy Prophet Yusuf, alayhi salam, whose freedom was not affected even when he was enslaved, defeated, and captivated. And this hadith attributed to Imam Sadiq highlights what we've been saying in the first part, that Yusuf, alayhi salam, is free despite all of the difficulties that he faced. Whether Yusuf was in the well, whether Yusuf was in the positions of power, or whether Yusuf was in the prison, he was free. But what that means is not a freedom that we perceive. It's an inner freedom, an inner state of being free. And it demonstrates for us that Yusuf relied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of his situations, whether good or bad, and he freed the shackles of his soul's inclinations towards his desires. That's what the Imam is trying to refer to here when he says that Yusuf is free. And we see this even within the Quran later on in Surah Yusuf. Yusuf himself says it after he's freed from prison and after he's cleared his name from the accusations that were made previously. He says, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي إِنَّ رَبِّي غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. That he says that I don't declare myself free, and that man's self and man's inclination is towards evil, except if Allah has mercy upon them, and Allah is the most forgiving and the merciful. So Yusuf himself understood that his soul could inclinate towards his desires, that it could fluctuate. But when the Imam says this, that Yusuf is free, Yusuf at the end of his life, after having gone through all the trials, all the tribulations, he is free then because he's demonstrated through his actions that he didn't wander, he didn't go astray, and that he stayed steadfast, and that he kept Allah at the front and center of his consciousness. And this is what Yusuf did throughout his time, and it's quite remarkable when you think about it, because Yusuf at a young age, when he was perhaps a young child, was subject to being left abandoned by his own family in the well. So if you imagine that, imagine abandoning, we've got so many young children here, imagine leaving them in a random part of Birmingham and just leaving them to their own devices. Which child would be thankful? Which child would be hopeful that God would save them? It's quite rare. So you see the strength of Yusuf's character, that even in those difficult situations where you would expect these young children to deviate, or where you expect a young adult to deviate, he never deviated, he stayed firm. And as you may have seen from the title, what I wanted to do is to bring this in line with what Syed the Shuhada, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, said, and the similar sentiments that were made by him and his companions on the day of Ashura as we approach the Arba'in that is commemorated every year. Because just as Yusuf said in the Quran that السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه, that prison is more beloved to me than what they call me towards, than the evil that they call me towards. Sayyid al-Shuhada and his family and companions express similar sentiments. They say, for example, we have various sayings attributed to them, such as dying a death of dignity is greater than a life of humiliation. Or you see various companions saying that if we could be martyred and resurrected and martyred again, continually we would do it for the cause of Hussein. And so we see the steadfastness and the resilience of these individuals, their preoccupation with the akhirah over the dunya. And this is what Yusuf and Imam al-Hussein show us, because sometimes when we look at it from the outside, when we look at it from the external perception, and we say, for example, see somebody that's in prison, we may say that they are in a bad situation. And then if we see somebody that's rich and has plenty of houses and cars and children, we might say that they're prosperous, that they're doing well in this life. But what Yusuf and Hussein teach us is that what may apparently seem bad in our perception is actually a form of blessing and a form of dignity, as opposed to humiliation, which may seem good to you and I. And the life of Yusuf and Hussein make us question whether we want to live a life of dignity, or rather would we take the easy option? Would we succumb to our desires? Would we succumb to what is easy to do, as opposed to taking the hard route, which may be difficult but may be more virtuous? And even recently, for a number of people I've spoken to over the months, many people have said that for example, I've gone to a protest in London, or I've gone to a protest in my city, in Manchester or Birmingham or wherever it may be, to oppose a genocide that's taking place. Many people and I've heard this myself, they said, I'm fearful that I may, for example, lose my job, or that I might become imprisoned because of my views, or that, for example, I might lose my income. Or other people will say, for example, say that I don't want to post on social media, I don't want to post on my social media platforms because my employer is looking at me, my work colleague is looking at me, and they may have different sentiments. So there's a fear there. There sometimes may not be a sincerity there. Sometimes people have a right to be fearful and worried. But what Yusuf shows us is that in every situation, even when he faced prison, he was content. Even when he faced difficulty, he was content, because ultimately he was pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and eventually the victory came to Yusuf. Likewise, we need to question whether we'd be willing to take certain stances, whether we'd be willing to speak out against injustices, whether we'd be willing to, for example, make changes within our lives to support the oppressed as opposed to support the unjust. And I even see it so many times within my workplace. So many people, they'll continue with their life as if nothing's happened. They continue, for example, their daily shops, not looking at the products that they're buying, not looking at the certain deodorants, shampoos, shower gels. They think that, for example, boycotting a particular drink company is enough. But there's so much to do, there's so much work to do. And so many people become lazy, they become lackadaisical about things, and they'll say, you know, oh, it's too difficult to boycott, for example, it's too difficult, it's more expensive to go for ethical products as opposed to the unethical ones, so I don't want to go for it. But really and truly, we need to ask ourselves a question that, you know, many of us have the fortune of having big families around us. We have our spouses, we may have children or nephews or nieces or whatever it may be within our households. And we have the fortune of living in this country where we don't have to think about potentially losing a child one day, losing a family member another day, being bombed on a daily basis. So is it really too difficult for us to make these ethical choices? Is it too difficult for us to make a change within our life and to start cultivating a change within ourselves in accordance with the spirit of Yusuf, in accordance with the spirit of Imam and Hussein? Or is it easy for us to just go about our continual day-to-day lives and just to say that, you know, we're getting paid, we're feeding our family's okay, it doesn't matter about anyone else? Or do we think more global? Do we think about the people that are suffering out there? And before I end, I wanted to maybe slightly deviate, go off a little bit off topic, but still within the bounds of this. One of the examples that I came across this Muharram was a letter or an event attributed to Imam Hussein, where on his journey to Karbala, as he's leaving Mecca, he approaches a caravan outside the area of Mecca. So if any of you have been to Umrah or they've been to Hajj, you would have come across this area called At-Tan'im or Masjid At-Tan'im, where you may, for example, renew your ihram when you're in the state of ihram, if you're going for Umrah and then you want to redo another Umrah, for example. And this Masjid Tan'im, Imam al-Hussein was in this area, and then a caravan of Yazid was coming, delivering goods from Yemen towards Asham. And the Imam takes the caravan, he takes the possessions, and he says to the people, according to this report, that I will pay for your fare if you want to return back to Yemen. I'm going to take these possessions, but if you want to come with me on my mission towards where he eventually goes to, you're free to come with me. You're free to stand against this tyrant. And what this shows us is that the Imam, even in this journey, he takes a stance of weakening the oppressor, weakening the unjust individual. And when we go back again and we look at the example of Yusuf that we gave previously, and when you analyze the verses of the Quran, constantly there's this theme in Yusuf's life that we missed and we haven't spoken about yet. But in each situation that Yusuf faced, whether he was a child and he was thrown into the well, his brothers made a scheme. They were jealous, they wanted to get rid of him, for example. Or when Yusuf was in the house of the aristocrat, his wife made a scheme against him. And then eventually, in each of these situations, Yusuf eventually, after a while, prevails. And Yusuf comes out on top. because he has the sincerity, he is focused on his godly duties, for example. Likewise, even in today, there are people that are scheming against us right here, right now. As we sit and as we gather, they're planning years ahead. People are planning to, cause us difficulties. Even as we see in the media now, for example, I don't want to get too political, but we look at, for example, parties like Reform and their anti-Muslim sentiments by many members of their party. Or if we look at media outlets like GB News and the rest of these garbage, if I'm being honest, many of them spew anti-Muslim sentiments and hatred continuously. And then eventually we'll get to a point where when the elections come round, people will, and this has already been predicted by many of the polls up until today, that many people are already switching towards Reform because of the issues that people are facing, because of the poverty that people are facing in this country right here and now, because of the housing crisis. And the Muslims are being used as a pawn in this game. The Muslims are being the ones that are being called the perpetrators of the worsening conditions of the people in this country. And we need to be smart and diligent about what our next moves are going to be as a community. We've seen now for the last couple of years a genocide taking place, and many of us have supported parties on either side of the coin, even though they're both the same faces of the same coin as far as I'm concerned. But many of us have supported one party or another. There's only really a two-party system in this country. And we've supported one or another. And many of us now have turned our back against these parties. And as the rise of these individuals who we may deem as the far right, although whether this right-left distinction exists, I don't know, but those that call themselves the far right may, for example, rise in the next year, next 2 years as the elections come on. But we need to ask ourselves whether we side with our old two-party systems and our two-party ways just to defeat the far right, or whether we make a conscious effort to support people and to support new parties and new movements that seek to make a change in the global sphere, that seek to make a change on the foreign conflicts that we're facing and the difficulties that the people are facing out there. And yes, there are going to be lots of Muslims that are going to say, for example, certain individuals from this new party, for example, Zara Sultana, they'll say she's been part of the LGBT rally, or she's been pro-abortion, for example, and they'll weaponize that and say that you don't need to vote for this party, you shouldn't vote for this party. But then what is the option? We need to think about this carefully and think about it more tactically, because our enemies want to utilize these far right to say, come back to Labour, come back to your Conservative Party or Labour Party who you think are helping you. But are they truly helping the Muslims or the oppressed out in the world, in Palestine, in Gaza? Are they helping even the people within this country that are suffering from poverty? Or do we make a stand against the hegemony of those people that push the capitalist agenda and keep people in difficulty and hardship? Or do we take a stance like Yusuf and Husayn and say that we would rather face a death of dignity than live a life of humiliation? Will we be ready to take that difficult step and help those that are oppressed? Inshallah, we end with the request to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of the marhumeen, particularly those people that have passed away recently and those of our brothers and sisters oppressed in the various regions in the world. And we end with Surah Al-Fatiha, Ma'a Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد المصطفى صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم وعلى علي المرتضى وعلى فاطمة الزهراء وعلى الحسن المجتبى وعلى الحسين الشهيد وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي وعلى حجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي المنتظر. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه وظهوره. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.